Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I hope you are all fine. Our course title is Language, Culture and Identity for the students of MA and BS English Semester 4. Our course code is ENGL2117. This lecture has been prepared by Miss Binish Pervez and Munir Yusuf from University of Education, Jorabad campus. Today our topic is linguistic imposition. Before we start the topic, I would like to make it clear that this topic has been divided into three parts. This lecture will be delivered to you in three different videos. Our first video deals with the introductory concepts of linguistic imposition and will discuss some of the issues of English language, some of the arguments of English language, that why English language should be imposed or why the study of English language is important. Linguistic imposition is commonly known as linguistic imperialism. Linguistic imposition is the imposition of one language on speakers of other languages. That is the definition of linguistic imposition, the most precise definition, that if we impose one language on the speakers of other languages, this is known as linguistic imposition. It is also known as linguistic nationalism or linguistic dominance or language imperialism. Basically, that term linguistic imperialism originated in 1930s as part of critique of basic English and was reintroduced by linguist Robert Philipson in his monograph Linguistic Imperialism. Robert Philipson was born in United Kingdom in 1942. He obtained master's degree at Cambridge and Leeds University, later followed by a doctorate degree in education in 1990. Philipson's background is largely language related, with his master's degree being in modern languages and linguistics and English language teaching. Before joining the ranks of university professors, Philipson worked for the British Council for almost a decade, assisting with teachers training, the English Teaching Information Centre, and working as a British Institute lecturer and English language officer. In his monograph, Linguistic Imperialism, he defines linguistic imposition as the dominance asserted and maintained by the establishment and continuous reconstitution of structural and cultural inequalities between English and other languages. In this definition, there are two main points to look at. Number one, that is the dominance which is asserted and maintained by the establishment. In the later part of third video, we will discuss that how English language was propagated in the colonial areas by the administration and the colonial administrators. And the number two is the continuous reconstitution of structural and cultural inequalities between English and other languages. Are the dominated languages are those languages on which English language was imposed. Those languages and those cultures were considered as inferior, and English language and English culture was considered as for superior and civilized. Philipson viewed linguistic imperialism as subtype of linguicism. Linguicism is a discrimination based on language or dialect. Linguistically argued racism. The very term was coined by linguist Tove Sknab-Kangnas. She is basically educationist After receiving her education, she worked for a short time at a teacher training college, and in 1967 and in 1966 she was in United States, where she worked at the Department of Nordic Languages at Harvard. After that, she worked briefly as a teacher. Since 1970s, she has worked as a scientist at universities in Finland and Denmark. In 1976, she obtained her first doctorate. The subject of her doctorate is bilingualism, and in that she defines the very term linguicism. She says that linguicism as ideology and structures that are used to legitimate, effectuate, and reproduce an unequal division of power and resources between groups, which are defined on the basis of languages. In that definition, ideologies and structures that are used to legitimate, effectuate, and reproduce an unequal division of power. The very first thing, that is unequal division of power. For for producing that unequal division of power, all the ideologies and the structures which are used and made them effective and legitimate, and the resources between groups which are defined on the basis of languages. She termed those ideologies and structures which are used for unequal division of power on the basis of language as linguicism. Linguistic imposition is basically the study of linguistic imperialism, and that study can help to clarify whether the winning of political independence led to a linguistic liberation of third world countries, just as India, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Bangladesh, and if not, why not? And are the former colonial languages a useful bond with international community and necessary for state formation and national unity internally? Or are they a bridgehead for Western interests, permitting the continuation of a global system of marginalization and exploitation? What is the relationship between linguistic dependence, just as continued use of European language in the former non-European colonies, and economic dependence, just as the export of raw materials and import of technology and know-how? Next, we have to differentiate between these terms. These are the simple terms. First one is imperialism, the second one is linguistic imperialism, and third one is cultural imperialism. Imperialism, as defined by J. Downing and Ali Mohammadi, is to conquer and control another country. That is known as imperialism. Just as in 21st century we have America that conquering different countries, just as Afghanistan and Iraq, and controlling that country. Linguistic imperialism is the transfer of a dominant language to the other people. Just as United Kingdom has done, they have conquered different parts of the world. They have conquered parts of Africa. They have conquered and controlled Australia, New Zealand, America, here in subcontinent. So they have conquered the country, controlled it administratively, and they have transferred their English language to the people of that country. The third one is cultural imperialism, that is superimpose one culture over another culture. Philipson's theory, we have a separate lecture to discuss that Philipson theory in detail and all the points which he has presented in his theory. Uh, Basically, that theory provides a powerful critique on historical spread of English as an international language and how it continues to maintain its current dominance, particularly in post-colonial contexts like India, Pakistan, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and also increasingly in new colonial contexts such as continental Europe. Philipson, in his theory, has particularly described that uh, countries which have gained freedom from the control of United Kingdom, after their freedom, English language still dominate them, especially and particularly in India and Pakistan and Zimbabwe. So there are some key underlying tenets of English, that why English language has been taught and how English language has been taught. There are some arguments and some policies and some number one is that English is best taught monolingually. That is known as monolingual fallacy. The monolingual fallacy is defined here in this context as the idea that the teaching of a second language, that is L2, should entirely be true L2. That if English is being taught to the non-native speaker of English, it ought to be taught in English language. Mother tongue is not allowed in that monolingual fallacy. Second one is that ideal teacher is native speaker. That is the native speaker fallacy. Native speaker fallacy, Robert Philipson formulated. The ideal teacher is a native speaker. That is the native speaker fallacy. Robert Philipson formulated that native speaker fallacy, in which he suggests that the ideal teacher of English is a native speaking teacher. English is best taught by English native speaker. Next is the early English is taught, the better the results are. That is known as the early start fallacy. That when for the better results, you have to start teaching English at the early stages, just as not great difference between the syllabus and curriculum design in Pakistan. Um, in 1990s, English started at the secondary level. Students started studying English in government schools when they were in grade 6. But now English is being taught to the students at the early stages at the primary level. That is the that is known as the early start fallacy. The next is more English is taught, the better the results are. Maximum English in the maximum exposure fallacy. In Pakistan and in India, the medium for the sciences and all the subjects except that of languages, it has been transferred to it has been transferred from native language to the English language. The next is, if other languages are used much, standards of English will drop. That is the subtractive fallacy. Subtractive fallacy lays focus on the use of English language as much as a teacher can. If a bilingual strategy is adopted in the classes, the standard of English will drop. That is the viewpoint of subtractive fallacy. English intrinsic arguments describe the language as God-given, rich, noble, and interesting. These arguments usually assert what English is and what other languages are not. That is the very first point. That is the very first argument which asserts that English is superior to the other languages. English extrinsic arguments point out that English is well established. They are trained, there are trained teachers and a multitude of teaching material. There are also abundant immaterial resources like knowledge of language. That is the main argument for the support of English language, that all over the world English is being taught and English teachers are trained and they have more material for the teaching. And you can, when you have to surface through the internet for any particular knowledge of, or especially knowledge of any language, you have English is there to help you. You have to use English as a tool. Next is English functional arguments emphasizes the usefulness of English as a gateway. Next is English functional arguments emphasizes the usefulness of English as a gateway to the world. Now in modern days, in 21st century, English has become the lingua franca of the world. If you have to interact with the people of the world, you use English as a medium of communication. So English usefulness is considered as a gateway to the world for all the businesses or reproductive function. It enables people to operate technology. Every technology that is its ideological function, it stands for modernity. It is a symbol for material advance and efficiency. Next concept which is associated with linguistic imposition is internationalization. Such internationalization of English might also bring new possibilities for native speaker of language. That is McCabe. McCabe in his book elaborates that whereas for 2 centuries we exported our language and our customs in hot pursuit of fresh markets, we now find that our language and our customs are returned to us but altered so that they can be used by others, so that our own language and culture discover new possibilities, fresh contradictions. McCabe describes English historical perspective that for the 2 centuries English colonial administrator exported English language and English custom for the fresh market. England had a policy of, so he says that after 200 years that they find there are some new possibilities and some contradiction in the language. Definitely language when one language is used by the speaker of another language, it can help. So next, we'll try to find linguistic imperialism in social linguistics. First of all, need to define what social linguistics is. Social linguistics is defined as the study of how the people around you and your heritage can change the way you speak, or more precisely, it is the branch of linguistics that analyzes the effects of social and cultural factors within a speech community upon its language pattern. It is a descriptive study of the effect of any or all the aspects of society, including cultural norms, expectations, and context, on the way language is used and society's effect on language. It differs from sociology of language, which focus on the effects of language on society. Social linguistics overlaps considerably with pragmatics. It is closely related to linguistics anthropology. Some questions the distinction between the two fields, emphasizing their historical interrelations. So linguistic imperialism can be found in social linguistics also. This is by now a well entrenched and a very respectable branch of social linguistics. It is concerned with describing the world of globalization and linguicides, often based on particular ecological metaphor. These approaches only assume that wherever a big and powerful language such as English appears in a foreign territory, small indigenous languages will die. There is In this image of social linguistic space, place for just one language at a time. In general, there seems to be a serious problem with the ways in which space is imagined in such works. In addition, the actual sociolinguistics deals of such processes are rarely spelled out. Languages can be used in vernacular or in lingua franca varieties and so create different sociolinguistic conditions for mutual influencing. Thanks courtesy to the Social Linguistics of Globalization, Cambridge University Press 2010. Colonialism and linguistic imperialism. Anachronistic views of linguistic imperialism, which sees as important only the power asymmetry between the former colonial nations and the nations of the Third World, are hopelessly inadequate as an explanation of linguistic realities. They especially ignored the fact that the First World countries with strong languages seems to be under just as much pressure to adopt English, and that some of the harshest attacks on English have come from the countries that have no such colonial legacy. When dominant languages feel they are being dominated, something much bigger than a simplistic conception of power relations must be involved. Coming back to linguistic imperialism and social linguistic and colonialism and imperialism, some argue that the historical and current bloodshed of Western imperialism has transformed English language into a universal tool of communication. Though centuries of colonialism, new colonialism, Cold War, expansionism, and most recently globalization, the West has spread its preferred system of capitalism, democracy, and moral values. The British, until the beginning of 20th century and more recently the Americans have emerged as the major sources of foreign influences throughout the globe. As a result of this, contemporary English is detached from any specific cultural identity. It is a tool which links between societies in an increasingly smaller world. The first population to speak English was the British. About 500 years ago, between 5 and 7 million people spoke the language. Today, about 1.8 billion people do so. Processes of the violent imperialism have paved the way for the cultural pandemic originating in the West. Until the 19th century, the British were the major superpower, and their method of colonialization induced establishing schools which taught English language and Western culture to locals who needed to be modernized. Most former British colonies now use English as their official language, such as South Africa. Ever since the US colonized Puerto Rico after winning the Spanish-American War, the official languages on the island became Spanish and of course English. Today, English is the third most spoken language in the world and tops the list of second languages. English is necessity for studying at the most prestigious institutions of higher learning, a ticket to working almost anywhere in the world, and an instrument enabling livelihood in the wealthiest nations. It has become the norm for non-native English speakers to communicate with other non-native English speakers in English if they do not share a native language. For example, Amsterdam is now populated by a large foreign community, most Italian, Spanish, and Chinese nationals who work there use English in their office to communicate amongst themselves. This phenomenon feeds into the growth of social inequality linked to globalization. The majority of time, English learned as a second language in public school does not create a proficiency level adequate for working, studying, or relying on the language in daily life. Private languages courses, private language courses, summer exchange programs abroad, and access to the international schools are expensive and limited to the privileged minority. As in common, this kind of globalization seems to only benefit the rich, as English becomes the new global norm for large-scale business. Innovation and science indigenous languages rich in cultural heritage and history often get put to the side. Rafael Tellis, a member of Puerto Rican Independence Party, claims that colonialism has destroyed the working culture of the most poor sectors of our population and created a culture of dependence. People dedicated their time and resources to the learning and perfecting their understanding and knowledge of English rather than preserving their own customs and culture. The process of globalization leads to visualize an area of opportunity and for better future linked to the English language. A language is not only an instrument of communication, it is also the tool of a society made up of its culture, tradition, and sets of religious and ideological beliefs. Each language has a nonsense which represents its origin, replacing indigenous Urdu or Hindi with English is comparable with marginalization of that particular culture. The second last part, that is, these approaches only assumes a big and powerful language such as English appear in a foreign territory, small indigenous language will die. So that is that the death of language is like burning of library. English has become the main language used in science. Doctors around the world use English to communicate their findings. Most recent papers are written in English as way to facilitate international scientific cooperation. Although this may seem like a necessity to promote scientific discovery, the resulting gap is problematic. The researchers who have not had the chance to learn English are at a disadvantage. The triumph of English in science is just one example. The language has infiltrated the most influential aspect of society around the world. The consequences is more divided world. Those who can speak English have access to innovation versus and those who do not have the means to learn the language and therefore lay behind. That colonialism and linguistic imperialism this focuses on that the use of English language. Should this development only be seen as negative? Globalization and the expansion of English language have resulted in oppression and inequality. But the creation of this widespread unintentional tool can also be put to positive use. If accessible to everyone, it can be used to avoid cultural misunderstandings, conflicts, and promote coexisting diversity. After that, I would like to take you back to a previous slide of internationalization, uh, in which I related that Macab, which elaborates that in the last lines, so that our own language and culture discover new possible and fresh contradictions. Uh, there are two examples of some contradictions or some of the altered traditions of the customs and the English language. One is that of India. India is a growing power, economic power, and they have created their own dialects in English. For example, economics, they pronounce it as economics, and they pronounce technology as technology. Similarly, the other rising power of the world is China. China has around about 279 universities which are offering scholarships to the foreign students, and that they have a year course of Chinese language. Students can only get the degree after completing that Chinese language course. The second is that of linguistic imperialism and colonialization. There are two examples from English literature. One is that character of Kurds in the novel Heart of Darkness. There is a character Kurds. Kurds, while he uses English language when he is insulting that colonized people. He said to them that he is there to civilize them, and the ivory which they are giving to them is not enough or is not of as importance as the language and as the knowledge which he is imparting to them and making them civilized. So whenever he has to abuse them uh, or threat them, he used the English language. And similarly, there is another novel written by Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. It is full of linguistic imperialism and colonialism. In fact, colonialism flourishes through linguistic imperialism. So imposition of English language over the colonialized people is a basic part of the basic part of English colonialism. So, in conclusion, we can conclude the whole of the lecture is that our indigenous languages are equally beautiful as English itself. English is coming uh, as a very strong force which cannot be stopped, so it is better to go with the current. Today, English has become the main language used in sciences and in researchers, doctors, and all the researchers around the world use English to communicate their findings. Most research papers are written in English as the way to facilitate international scientific cooperation. So it is better to go with English. And in modern world, English is considered as a key to success. We can promote multilingual society, but we must grasp English since almost every important aspect of life is related to English. So that was all from the today's lecture. These are some of the reference for which we have taken the material for making mm, lecture for you. It mostly includes references from Robert Phillipson's Linguistic Imperialism as well as some of the articles from the Dawn. And thank you so much